In early 1666, the long-awaited Jewish Messiah was poised to overthrow the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, cross Sabbatai River, and return astride a lion, leading an army composed of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. He would wed the daughter of Moses the prophet and gather the exiles. The nations of the world would bow before him, and the third temple in Jerusalem would be built, inaugurating the messianic age. The dead would be resurrected, and as the years passed, the Messiah would become so spiritually elevated that both he and the world he redeemed would be utterly transformed, becoming wholly spiritual and united again in perfect harmony with the divine. Unknown numbers, perhaps the majority of the world's Jews from Yemen to Holland and distant Brazil, were prepared to return to Israel. Prayer books were already printed proclaiming the King Messiah. New religious festivals were developing, and the day of fasting and sorrow, the 9th of Av, had already been transformed into a day of ecstatic joy. And on September 16th, 1666, 356 years ago to the date of this episode being released, the King Messiah, faced with the threat of conversion or excruciating execution, apostatized. Amirah, the King Messiah Shabbatai Zevi, had become Aziz Mehmet Effendi, royal doorkeeper. For most, messianic fervor turned to horror and embarrassed disillusionment. But for a few most loyal to this Kabbalistic Messiah, his apostasy was simply a new act in the very arc of redemption itself. And for nearly 4 centuries now, that tiny underground group, or the Maimonim, the believers, have held their secret hope alive that an occulted, even divinized Shabbatai Zevi will return to bring with him the final redemption. The historical events of that feverish year of messianic expectation from Rosh Hashanah of 1665 to September 16, 1666 are perhaps among the perplexing in Jewish history. Just how did all this happen? And of course, there's no simple answer to that question. But in this episode, I want to explore the more esoteric dimension of the messianic appeal of that period. The Kabbalistic arguments for Shabbatai Zevi's claim to have been the King Messiah. By exploring the writings of his chief theoretician, prophet, and, well, PR guy, Nathan of Gaza, we can see how Lurianic Kabbalah was marshaled, but also deeply transformed to underwrite these messianic claims, including Shabbatai's bizarre behavior, blasphemous behavior, and even the heretical and antinomian turns the movement would eventually take. Let's explore the Kabbalistic theology of the heretic Messiah. If you're interested in the history of magic, Hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the academic study of the occult, make sure to subscribe and check out my other content on topics in esotericism, including many different kinds of curated playlists. Also, if you want to support this work, providing accessible, scholarly, conspiracy theory free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider supporting my work on Patreon, or the one-time donation, or with the cool super thanks option that you now have down there below the video. But now, let's turn to the origins of creation, of evil itself, and how the soul of the Messiah, plunged into the abyss of pure evil, the realm of the Klippot, would eventually emerge to redeem all of reality itself. The theology of the heretic Messiah, Shabbatai Zevi. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Now, to be sure, this episode is not meant to be a primer on Shabbatai Zevi or the Messianic movement during and after his life. I'm going to assume some basic familiarity with all of that. After all, this channel, Esoterica, isn't meant really to be introductory level content most of the time. But if you do want a really solid academic refresher on Shabbatai Zevi and the messianic movement that he inspired, Religion for Breakfast has a great episode on just that topic, and I'd highly recommend checking it out. Also, I have to do this. I'd warn against 90% of the information on Shabbatai Zevi and the messianic movement left in its wake on the internet. It's awash with, let's call them valueless anti-Semitic internet grifters, whose analysis will somehow make you stupider having watched it. I've actually included a bibliographic list of reliable scholarship in the description if you want to really dig into the topic of Shabbatai Zevi or Frankism or what have you. Now, we're also going to be exploring some pretty technical elements in the Lurianic Kabbalah as well, so you might also want to review that before we get going. Again, this channel ain't called Esoterica for nothing. Prior to Shabbatai Zevi's early proclamation of himself as the Messiah, dating to around 1648 or so, and Nathan's technical Kabbalistic defense of such claims composed in the mid-1660s, both of these guys had had profound mystical insights independent of one another. Shabbatai, having learned almost from the Zohar exclusively, had come to a profound, though dynamic, changeable insight into what he called the mystery of the Godhead. And Nathan had developed, well, supernatural healing powers, the very healing powers that would actually eventually attract Shabbatai Zevi to visit him there in Gaza in the first place. Further, Nathan, despite his young age, he's only about 20 at the time, would become shockingly proficient in the highly technical intricacies of Lurianic Kabbalah. I mean, it's mind-blowing how fast he learned this stuff, especially learned in the debates around the primeval period of the Tzimtzum, or the divine contraction, up to the penetration of the divine light into that vacuum of the Tzimtzum, but prior to the emanation of the Sephirotic system. Yeah, that primeval, after the first movements of the hidden divine will, but before the Sephirot themselves became differentiated. Like that early on in the system, that's where the big debates were, but a lot more on that, all of that in just a moment. Now, as I mentioned, Shabbatai's mystical insight into the mystery of the Godhead, despite his, well, constantly transforming and deepening its meaning through the years, focused on restoring accessibility to the proper object of faith and worship for the people of Israel, i.e., the true God of worship. Shabbatai keyed in on a core problem that arises out of the concept of the divine, central in the main book of the Kabbalah, the Sefer Zohar, the Book of Radiance. There, the primary source of all being via emanation remains itself utterly hidden from all knowledge or speculation or comprehension. Ein Sof, the infinite, the divine abyss of nothingness or no-thingness, is beyond all comprehension, it's beyond all speculation, and it's beyond all linguistic predication. One can't even speak of it being in any meaningful sense. Rather, the divine is actually known through a series of later emanations, the famous Sfirot. And even then, the first three Sfirot, Keter, Chokhmah, and Binah, are also beyond all comprehension, but are concentrated in the synthetic Sephirah of Tiferet, which is the revealed glory of the divine and corresponds to the name of the divine as revealed to humanity, the Tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He. But that creates an odd tension. It renders the true source of divinity not only beyond all comprehension, but also beyond all worship. It makes Judaism as a religion of worship of divine oneness impossible. Shabbatai's mystical insight is also a glimpse into his flair for the heterodox. He simply doubles down on the importance of the Sphira of Tiferet. Rather than understanding it as the revealed compression of the otherwise unknowable upper Sphirot, or the utterly unknown causeless cause of all causes, Ein Sof, he posits the ontological priority of Tiferet as Ein Sof enclosed or made manifest as a very necessary object of faith and worship. By extension, because Ein Sof was expressed in Tiferet, this would also unlock the higher Sephirotic structure, thus access to the supernal world, the supernal spiritual worlds, and the Torahs. Yeah, Torahs, plural, contained within them. Now, Shabbatai would alter, shift, deepen, and transform this understanding of the mystery of the Godhead, but the key idea of Tiferet as Ein Sof manifest as the God of faith and worship, as opposed to the more Maimonidean God of Ein Sof as the uncaused cause of all causes. Indeed, in a short essay early on in the Messianic movement, Nathan of Gaza would actually reinterpret the allegory of Jonah and the ship from Zoharic literature. In the Tikkunei Zohar, a later strata of Zoharic literature, the ship represents the body and Jonah represents the soul. Whereas here in the Messianic movement, faith in that movement actually puts further wind into the sails, to, I guess, continue using that metaphor, thus actually hastening the redemption. Indeed, Nathan urges that this text, the Jonah text, and other penitential texts and hymns, were actually a means to drive prayers up the Sephirot from the vice-regent of Tiferet up, like waves crashing into one another, creating a kind of frenzy of divine flow back up to the divine void of Keter, even back up into the cause of all causes up there in Ein Sof. An utterly daring possibility only made possible through Shabbatai's unlocking of the mystery of the Godhead. In that focus of his unlocking access to the supernal worlds through faith, through emunah, through faith, would play a decisive role in almost everything to come in the Shabbatian theology. While Shabbatai's speculations about the mystery of the Godhead would provide a unique breakthrough, or a Narishkite heretical breakdown, depending on your mileage here, it would also be up to his prophet, Nathan of Gaza, to actually build out a fully developed Kabbalistic theory to justify not just Sabbatai Zevi's messianic claims, but also his aberrant behavior, his apparent apostasy, and, well, his death. Nathan would set to that task in 1665 in a series of extraordinary treatises, letters, and liturgical documents, many of which remain untranslated, many of which only recently got republished. And what I want to do is attempt to trace out what these arguments for the feverish period prior to Shabbatai's apostasy consisted of, and how they function within the larger Lurianic system of Kabbalah more generally. Focusing primarily on Nathan's Derush HaTanaim, or the Treatise on the Dragons. Many of these early documents were actually written to explain to the early adopters of the Messianic faith, like, the wealthy Chalebi Raphael Joseph, who would actually bankroll the first years of the movement. You got to get that guy on board, the money guy. But just what did these people have their faith in exactly? What did it mean for Shabbatai Zevi to be a Messiah at all? Like all Messianic movements, faith in a leader almost always comes first, with just what that means, sometimes taking centuries to work out. Think of the debates about the nature of Jesus following in the centuries after his followers were damn sure he was the Messiah. Despite that whole dying part, maybe he came back. Thus, Nathan brings to bear the most powerful theosophical tool he has access to do just that work: the system of the Lurianic Kabbalah on just those messianic questions. Now, I want to impress upon you just how learned Nathan was at the age of basically 20. If you've ever learned Lurianic Kabbalah, you've probably actually just learned a relatively tidy version of the system of divine contraction, or Tzimtzum, the first ray of the divine light, the shattering of the vessels, the rise of evil from the powers of strict judgment, or Din, the origin of all the souls in the supernal body of Adam Kadmon, the exile and return of Shekhinah, etc., etc. But you might just not be aware of how absolutely contentious most of that was in the early days of grappling with what would become that relatively tidy version of Lurianic Kabbalah. There were significantly rival schools. Even Chaim Vital obscured and interpolated his own ideas into the Kitvei Ha'ari when Luria's own ideas made him theologically uncomfortable. Further, other non-Chaim Vital expressions of Luria's ideas, such as those published by Israel Sarug or Joseph ibn Tabul, though less popular now, may actually better represent the primitive Lurianic teachings. This was especially true when it came to the most contentious issues of that time period. What exactly happened in the process after Tzimtzum or divine contraction, but before the emanation of the Sefirot, especially in terms or regards the origin of evil or the Klippot. Now, Nathan of Gaza, better than virtually any of us today, understood not only that there was a real debate to be had about this, but he also understood the various positions in that debate, though he did understand them as all being kind of true at various esoteric levels of analysis. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But he would offer a pretty synthetic solution. Further and more importantly, his solution would center on the origins of the soul of the Messiah and its struggle with the demonic Klippot at the heart of that utterly primeval period. A truly radical, novel solution found in neither the Zohar nor in the complex and diverse Lurianic speculations of his day. This is truly Nathan of Gaza's most pioneering move in the history of the Kabbalah. Now, the earliest mystical texts produced by Nathan are pseudepigraphic or forged. They're an account of a pious medieval rabbi named Abraham whose visions of the Messiah literally name and account for the birth date of Shabbatai Zevi. They name him Shabbatai Zevi, and they will say he's going to be born on Shabbat of the 9th of Av. That's actually the day held by the rabbis to be the birth date of the Messiah, so that's convenient Shabbatai. That aside, the theological core of the text includes the messianic idea of restoring the crown to its pristine glory. This is a reference to Shabbatai's revelation of the mystery of the Godhead mentioned earlier, such that Israel's worship will be properly restored, but that all of this is going to be accomplished through emunah, or faith, such that the just shall live by faith, one of the most popular verses from Tanakh in Shabbatian theology. The first letters of that verse kind of spell out Zevi, like Zvi from Habakkuk. No, I'm not kidding, they kind of do. But further, that this faith or emunah is required for, among various other reasons, that the Messiah will undergo terrible torments and will perform strange and awesome deeds, even up to his own martyrdom to perform the will of the Creator. In many ways, these early visionary texts set the stage for the more dramatically developed theology found in Nathan's groundbreaking treatise on the dragons, to which I want to turn to now. The treatise on the dragons, or the Drush Tatanaim, is ostensibly a commentary on Zohar Volume 2, 34a through 35b, a notoriously difficult mythological section dealing with the origins of evil and the Klippot as a dreadful primeval dragon sunk into the pre-creation watery abyss. Now, as I've mentioned in my episode about the origins of the Klippot in the Zohar, worth checking out again if you want to review this material, this text can't quite make up its mind about just what the origins of evil are. The Zohar is kind of all over the place with this question. But in this narrative, they seem to be primevally, perhaps even co-eternally real with the divine. That is to say, the divine light of emanation is not fully able to penetrate the murky deep of the demonic abyssal sea. Thus, the divine light serves to actually nourish this evil, thus allowing it to escape into various underground channels, leaving evil residue behind, which become the demonic Klippot of the Sitra Achra, the sinister other side of creation. But, as I mentioned, the Zohar has several narratives about the origin of evil, and harmonizing and systematizing these accounts became of paramount interest to later Kabbalists. Of course, the priority of this task makes perfectly good sense. I mean, the origins of evil will also be logically linked to redeeming and overcoming just that evil, and that's one of the central goals, maybe the central goal of the Kabbalah itself. And it's precisely into that debate that Nathan will provide his answer and center the questions of the origin and destiny of the Messiah's soul, a theoretic innovation wholly unique to Shabbatian theology. So Nathan takes up the standard debate about the primeval conditions where they were in his time, basically. Following the initial movement of the divine will in the act of tzimtzum, or contraction, a vacuum-like state is left behind called the tehiru. I say vacuum-like because it's not totally empty. Within the tehiru, there is a kind of residue of Ein Sof left behind, a bit like what happens if you try to pour olive oil out of a container. There's always some of it left, a kind of thin layer, a residue of oil left behind in the vacuum of the jar or whatever. This residue, or the reshimu left over by the contraction of Ein Sof, contains an admixture of pure chesed, or mercy, and pure din, or strict judgment, from which the sfirot and the Klippot will ultimately emerge, or what the Klippot actually are. And that's where the first front in this debate really opens up. Did pure din, or strict judgment as evil itself, exist within the divine abyss of Ein Sof all along? Luria seems to have thought so, but Vital was uncomfortable with this notion, it seems, and in the standard text of Eitz Chaim, the differentiation of pure din as such, in the Sitra Achra, happens much later in the emanation of the Sephirotic system, which at this point produces evil as we know it. That's the din part producing evil without being checked by chesed. Thus it seems that the debate is about whether evil existed as a primordial condition within the Godhead of Ein Sof, or as the result of later divine emanations at another stage of creation. Following the Zohar at 234a and following, Nathan seems to posit that not only does the residual Reshimu contain the Klippotic dinim, or forces of judgment or evil, which are left behind as a kind of divine catharsis prior to creation itself, but the vacuum-like Tehiru itself is negatively charged. That is to say, there are forces near the divine which are energetically and creatively inclined, but the lower reaches of the Tehiru, the region that Nathan terms the golem, or the unformed or the undifferentiated, are marked by their passivity and their anti-creation gravitation, dragging into those depths the residual dinim, or Klippot, which eventually congregate and collect in the lower half of that vast abyss of the golem. This would be developed further, especially in both the thoughtsome and thoughtless light in Ein Sof that forms the contour of the Tehiru in Nathan's later post-apostasy book of creation. But in this more radical take, the Sitra Achra, or the other side, isn't the other side of the Sfirot, it's the Sitra Achra of Ein Sof itself. Probably one of the most daring and provocative ideas ever expressed in Kabbalah, but again, that's more from the book of creation. There's a more moderate form to be found of this idea in the Treatise on the Dragons. Thus, the primeval state of being prior to the insertion of the divine light, which inaugurates creation properly in the Kabbalah, is for Nathan one profoundly dualistic in nature, and even overwhelmingly tending toward evil as a non or even anti-creation force. There are only the forces of the upper Tehiru, marked by the Reshimu of pure chesed, and one more decisive element, the souls of the righteous that the Klippot clung to within the divine abyss of Ein Sof, dragging them into the darkness. These powerfully righteous souls will go on to be folks like Abraham and Moses, the most important people in this mythology, but they are at this point the fuel upon which the parasitic Klippot feed, which, so far from the divine light, are actually necessary for the demonic husks to maintain any existence at all. Plunged into the very abyss of near non-being, these souls are like fuel cells which prevent the Klippot from tattering off into pure non-existence, at least in this primitive period of creation. And this is where Nathan's most dramatic move happens. Plunged into the deepest depths of the Klippot, into the hellish torment of the parasitism at the very abyss of non-existence, is the tortured soul of the Messiah. Here the soul of the Messiah, plunged into the darkest depths of the abyss of the Tehiru, struggles with the worst of the Klippot, the horrid dragon of the abyss. Indeed, in some of the more extreme passages, it appears that the soul of the Messiah even began as an aspect of this horrid dragon of the depths, though Nathan never seems totally willing to commit to that position, and even slight changes in the reading of the Hebrew seem to change whether he actually commits to this. I don't think he ever really does. But even if he did, it would fit within the idea of the dialectic of the resolution of evil into good through the process of redemption. But at this point, Nathan picks up on a concept from Chaim Vital, the now representative student of Luria. This is the concept of the holy ruse, the holy deception of the Klippot. For Vital, especially holy souls, thus those settled into the depths of the Tehiru, could only be released from the clutches of the Klippot by an act of cunning or divine trickery or fraud to trick the forces of evil into releasing those really righteous souls. Remember, the Klippot need them to feed upon. This was primarily done by the divine destining those souls to undergo or commit a deed in their life so awful or morally outrageous that the forces of the Klippot thought that would actually allow them to both feed off of them in this primeval period, but also because such horrible deeds would eventually be committed, they could also recapture these various powerful souls and thus return them to the depths of the abyss, having committed such dreadful misdeeds, to feed on them forever. But because the divine had planned just such a ruse, these apparent sins would actually allow these very powerful souls a kind of escape velocity from the forces of the Klippot, by engaging in a higher degree of redemptive work. The minor sins, relatively speaking, would be overcome by a huger arc of redemption. Thus, for instance, Abraham was conceived by a menstruating and thus ritually unfit woman whose father, his father, Terah, was an idol maker who helped lead the world astray. But it would be Abraham who would pioneer monotheism and put the world on the straight path, I guess. Or David, who admits in Psalm 51 that he was conceived, literally conceived in sin, and would commit horrible moral outrages during his whole life. But he created the conditions for the Israelite polity and the temple, thus gambling that being born in such conditions and given to such sins in life, the Klippot wagered they will win twice by releasing these souls. But upon doing so, the trap is set and the Klippot are eventually beaten back, the initial sin giving way to a greater arc of redemption. But their tortured sojourn in the realm of the Klippot leaves behind a kind of scar upon their very being, such they have a tendency towards such sins and actually delight in them or are indifferent to such devilish behavior. Thus, as the Talmud has it, the more righteous a person is, the more tortured by sin they are, thus explaining David's tendency toward violence and sexual aggression, and Abraham's apparent complete ease at being asked to sacrifice his only son, his beloved son, who isn't his only son, is Ishmael, but whatever. This Klippotic evil has influenced their very souls. It makes them prone to acts of evil, and perhaps even delighting in that evil. This mechanism of the holy ruse is just what Nathan of Gaza needs in his messianic theology vis-a-vis Shabbatai Zevi. The soul of the Messiah, sunk into the very heart of the abyss and most acutely struggling with the worst of the forces of the Klippot, would eventually emerge from those depths. But the Klippotic influence will remain so profound that he would undergo the heights of divine illumination, followed by the depths of soul-crushing sorrow, thus explaining Shabbatai's apparent manic-depressive personality cycles. But this would also be used to explain the apparently transgressive actions performed by Shabbatai, his strange deeds, which are apparent violations of the Torah, even inversion of such commandments, such that they can be accompanied by a kind of even blasphemous blessing, punning on the morning blessing for freeing the captive, matir asurim, as opposed to allowing the forbidden, matir isarim. There's no change in the spelling, it's just a pun that's kind of delightfully heretical. But Nathan takes this even a step further. Still leaning on the Zohar, Nathan sees the Messiah's soul as akin to Job, who the rabbis imagine being a servant actually in the court of Pharaoh, and whose offerings either were purely good or purely evil, hence as being uniquely affected by the forces of evil, of the Klippot. But once he's undergone both radical evil and radical good, he dialectically rises above both and ascends to the very realm of the divine itself. Remember, he challenges God. And in doing so, he leaves the court of Pharaoh, a metaphor for the realm of the Klippot. In fact, the Zohar calls the chief dragon of the abyss, among other things, Pharaoh. But in transcending his soul as the suffering Job, the Messiah becomes the chief power over the abyss itself. Not as an evil Pharaoh, but in a Hebrew pun, as one that circumcises the power of the Klippot, para, removing the impure foreskin and thus redeeming even the great evil of the pharaonic dragon. Also, just as a shocking aside at this point, the Klippah that's also referenced here, beside being Pharaoh, is none other than Jesus. Jesus, yes, Jesus of Nazareth, is taken by Nathan to be the most sinful soul to have ever existed, led the world into apostasy according to him, and was thus dragged back into the world of the Klippot after his execution. He afflicts the soul of the true Messiah and thus must be redeemed in the process of the final tour de force of the process of redemption. Thus, in the depths of the abyss, the true Messiah, Shabbatai Zevi, must redeem the ultimate false Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth, from evil itself. With people like me reading this being like, nope, nopity, nope, 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 nope. I am glad I am not involved in any of that, chas v'chalila. In addition to these elements in which the soul of the Messiah is introduced to understand the origin of evil and its eventual redemption, Nathan will also introduce an element of early Kabbalah that had actually otherwise been rejected by both the great systematizer Cordovero, who I'm a total fanboy of, and even Itzhak Luria. This is a super early 13th century proto-Kabbalistic text, maybe probably influenced by apocalyptic Christian prophets like Joachim of Fior, that actually argued for a series of ages, or Shmitot, which correspond to a procession within the very Sephardic structure itself. This is like a metaphysical clock counting down to the final redemption, passing through each subsequent sphira along the way. Nathan would impose the Luranic system of the divine countenances, or the Partsufim, upon this system, and argued that with the coming of the Messiah, this marked this transition of the world, all of this world, into the highest grouping, the Partsuf of Abba and Ima, mother and father, thus again allowing the Messiah access to the very cause of all causes and the very apex of the divine countenances, or the Partsufim. In fact, this explains Shabbatai's particular love of the rather bawdy Ladino love song Melizelda, the Emperor's Daughter, to which he actually attached deep Kabbalistic meaning, and Melizelda actually became a kind of bona fide Shabbatian hymn in that world. I will say, it's actually a really nice song, and Ladino music is just amazing, so if you've never heard this great Shabbatian song, you should look it up. Again, this is a novel use of an older and rejected Kabbalistic concept adapted to Lurianic Kabbalah in the interest of driving the messianic agenda forward. And that agenda brings us to the last two early Shabbatian concepts I want to discuss. With the mystery of the Godhead opened the transition of the Partsufim to the highest configuration of Abba and Ima, and the Messiah's soul having escaped the clutches of the Klippot, the final messianic drama could really begin in earnest. Shabbatai, given the exaltation of his soul and its links to Job, would dwell on the earth for exactly 140 years. Shabbatai Zevi was 40 at the time of his declaration that he was the Messiah, and rabbinical lore has Job living for 140 years, so Shabbatai is going to live for another 100. Then, he would leave behind his physical body, whereby he would undergo some type of occultation. This idea is probably being borrowed from Shia theology, and subsequent apotheosis. He would realign the spherotic tree into its ultimately balanced form, and therefore complete the final redemption of all reality. No big whoop. Regardless, recall that even an instance of martyrdom Messianic martyrdom was conceivable to Nathan in 1665 in the vision of Abraham. What wasn't, I strongly suspect, would be his soon coming apostasy. But just as the soul of the Messiah was reaching up into the very heights of divinity, the final souls of human beings were descending from the heels of the primeval spiritual anthropoid, Adam Kadmon. These powerfully dangerous souls from the heels of Adam Kadmon would be only redeemable by the Messiah and the faithful believers, and would come into apocalyptic conflict with the faithful, thus inaugurating a period of intense final persecution. You can see all this lining up just to be a disaster. But just as the soul of the Messiah was ever uplifting and the souls from the heels of Adam Kadmon were descending, Nathan of Gaza introduced what is perhaps the most dangerous doctrine of the movement, the reception of the Torah of the upper worlds. In this conception, one actually held by otherwise very orthodox Kabbalists, the physical Torah with its material laws and time-bound commandments was only brought into existence because of the sin of Adam, which produced a physical reality in some ways in the first place. Thus, the Torah of this world was a Torah of physical space and time, of materially putting on tefillin and physically uttering prayers. But the Torah is eternal and exists in all the realms of reality with laws appropriate to those levels of reality. Thus, the Torah of the higher spiritual realms will not only not be a physical practice performed by bodies in space and time, but may even contain practices inimical to the Torah of the lower physical world. Again, this isn't really anything terribly new. What's new is Nathan's claim that the believers may very well have souls from those very supernal worlds, and thus the Torah of this physical realm may not or soon will not be binding upon them. But, to be very clear here, Nathan of Gaza seems to land on the position that until the redemption is at a slightly more advanced state, how much more advanced isn't clear, but probably not until Shabbatai rules at least the physical world, that's to say the world of governments, and gets rid of the Ottoman Sultan, and probably not until the Third Temple is established, which Nathan definitely thought was going to occur in a few short years from 1665. That is to say, the believers themselves must maintain observance of the Torah of this world. The exception being the new feast day of the 9th of Av, that day of mourning, actually been transformed just because the Messiah had appeared, and that's pretty standard Talmud stuff actually. However, while Shabbatai may himself engage in strange deeds, sometimes in violation of the Torah of this world, Nathan argued that the average normal believer in Shabbatai's messianic claims must simply maintain their faith in the coming redemption without foregoing the Torah of this world. Yet, of course, knowing what we know about the vicissitudes of the Messianic movement, from Shabbatai's apostasy, his death in exile, the incarnationalism factions that rose up after his death, the group apostasies following his death, the rise of the Don Meh, along with the utter disaster of Frankism and the European crypto-Sabbatians that probably existed in the 19th century, it's easy to look back at these elements of the early Shabbatian theology and say, well, we saw that coming. We could clearly see that was heretical. But I want to point out, a lot of this, if we put it in the context of the theology of the time, isn't heretical. The first is that basically none of these beliefs are actually heretical in themselves. There was nothing heretical about claiming that Sabbatai Zevi was the Messiah in 1665, or even really up to that faithful day in 1666. Further, none of the theological innovations I've discussed in this episode would be considered heretical at that time. Unconventional, and maybe even pushing it a bit, but probably not so beyond the pale of the rather wide Kabbalistic fervor and speculation of that time in the mid-1660s. Everybody was on the Messiah train, the end of the world train, the Kabbalah train. It was just in the air. Finally, while all these ideas could and would be pushed to endorse the eventual antinomian wing of the movement, who Scholem refers to as the nihilists, Nathan's theological innovations don't, by any means, necessitate that outcome, much less any concept of redemption through sin, which is grist for the mill of those valueless anti-Semitic internet grifters that I mentioned near the beginning of this episode. In fact, it's a real pity that Scholem used the concept of mitzvah ha'ba'avera, translated as redemption through sin, in that article as the title for his groundbreaking essay on research into Shabbatianism, because one, that concept doesn't really play any real role in the Shabbatian theology of redemption, certainly not in these foundational documents, and not really in later documents either. And two, mitzvah ha'ba'avera is settled law even in the Talmud. Any mitzvah performed through a sinful act is disqualified. Disqualified. You can't steal a lulav and esrog and get the mitzvah of shaking them. Nathan of Gaza even held the door to the believers appealing to a higher Torah to justify any kind of antinomian behavior. Of course, the movement was larger than Nathan of Gaza, and the antinomian faction did get a solid foothold, despite, I think, more than because of the actual Kabbalistic theology that underwrote this especial period pre-apostasy. Regardless, the theology of Nathan of Gaza and Sabbatai Zevi together, especially in the pre-apostasy period, remains absolutely fascinating, just as do the writings in the period post his apostasy, especially Nathan's seminal book of creation, but that's a topic for another time. The amount of Shabbatian literature that has actually been published, reliable Shabbatian literature, has actually exploded in the past few decades, though sadly Nathan of Gaza's more speculative works have either been out of print, neither translated into English, or both. Luckily, however, new editions of the Treatise on the Dragons and the Book of Creation are out in just recent couple years, at least in new Hebrew editions. Though the edition of the Book of Creation is, let's say, an interesting attempt at rehabilitating Nathan of Gaza as a Torah sage in Israel, but good luck with that. I mean, they can't even get Spinoza unexcommunicated, so whatever. Regardless, a critical edition of the works of Nathan of Gaza, his entire corpus, remain a serious desideratum. Again, a lot of the information online about Shabbatianism, and especially Frankism, is dumpster fire levels of quality, so I'd only really trust peer-reviewed texts like those in the description that I provide if you want to learn more about Shabbatianism and Frankism and its development in history. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.